Hello, people. So we've spent the last few weeks in this series called Potential, and it's all about dating, which brings me to this quick question. Do you know someone, anyone, who totally throws out common sense, throws it out the window when it comes to dating? Now, maybe that person is really careful when it comes to nearly every other area of life. But when it comes to dating, people, like they want to be with someone so bad that they seem to settle for anyone, or they overlook tons of red flags just so they can date someone. Like, we all have that one friend who says things like, I know they aren't perfect, and I know they've done bad stuff in the past, but they've changed. Or they really like me. They would never do that to me. And in your head, you're like, hasn't every other person that dated them said the exact same thing? Look, like sometimes it's easy for us to throw logic out the window just because we want somebody or we want to date somebody. Now, this can be funny and no big deal when friends do this and things work out. But other times it can be sad, right? Like people end up hurt. And it's easy to think things like, why would you do that? Or why in the world would you settle? Or don't you know how this is going to end? Don't you know how it always ends? In some ways, that's why people talk about regret so much when it comes to dating. It isn't that dating itself is bad. Dating can be great. It can be a great part of your high school years. But sometimes the emotional entanglement of a relationship can make it tough to see things clearly. Or sometimes we want to be in a relationship so bad that it can be easy to make choices that we probably wouldn't make otherwise. We can end up making choices that we simply regret because of the pressure that we feel. And what's interesting is that although we can see it when it's happening to other people, we often don't always see it when it comes to ourselves. For example, got a mirror, got a magnifying glass here, right? You all know what a mirror does, right? You can see yourself, but have you ever used a magnifying glass? It blows things up so that you can see them better. This is what we do sometimes. We use a magnifying glass with other people, but we absolutely refuse to use a mirror with ourselves. For example, maybe one of your friends dated someone who doesn't have the best reputation, and you thought that he or she was making a bad decision, right? Looking at it through the magnifying glass. But then you met someone who also didn't have a great reputation, but for different reasons. And because you felt like your situation was different, you were confident that you could handle whatever happened, or that you could change them in some way. So you didn't look in the mirror, people. Maybe one of your friends had clear boundaries about what they would and wouldn't do physically in a dating relationship, and then they dated someone who pressured them to cross those lines. Not the best idea, right? And you're all of a sudden looking at them through the magnifying glass. But then you started dating someone and thought, you know what? It's not that big of a deal. Feelings were hovering around 10 on a scale of 1 to 10. You felt pressure from them or from yourself to do things you thought you wouldn't do. Friends, you refused to look in the mirror. Maybe you had solid evidence that your friend was being cheated on. So you told them, you're looking at it through the magnifying glass, but there was nothing you could do to get your friend to believe you. So they stayed with them, which was clearly a bad choice that wouldn't end well. But then you dated someone and you got word that they cheated on you. Obviously, you're done with them, right? But you felt like it was better to be with someone who hurt you than to be by yourself, and you refused to look in the mirror. We all tend to have the same general rules when it comes to dating. Don't date a cheater or someone who brings you down or pulls you away from your values. But when we actually start catching feelings for someone, the pressure to make decisions, it gets a little higher. And those rules tend to become a little more flexible. We say things like, oh man, it's fine. It's just the way it is. Or we say, man, I can control this. I'm not gonna let this thing get out of hand. Or, hey, I can handle the consequences, okay? Everybody relax, I'm good. And these views can bring us to a place where we make less than great dating decisions. So, to talk about all of this, we're gonna look at a story from Scripture together that involves the most famous king of Israel, a guy named David. Now, David has a lot of greatest hits, y'all, including stories like David and Goliath. If you've ever heard of David, you probably think of him pretty positively. He was known as a great leader and is even described as a man after God's own heart. Even with that kind of clout, he still had his downfalls. And the event we're looking at today took place during a war with the Ammonites, one of Israel's biggest enemies. Now, during that time, when a nation went to war, it was normal for the kings to fight alongside their troops. But this time, David decided not to be like the other kings. So the passage goes like this. In the spring of the year, when kings normally go out to war, David sent Joab and the Israelite army to fight the Ammonites. So David was essentially like, you know what, y'all, I think I'm good this time. Y'all go out, y'all fight, have fun. I'm gonna stay here. And that decision had consequences that would unfold later. By choosing to stay home, David was essentially sending this message to his troops. I want you to take care of the hard stuff, but I'm gonna hang back home. And y'all, that was just the beginning. So while his army was at war, David was home, David was bored. This is like summer, right? When school's out and all your friends are busy and you're sitting at home with nothing to do all day long and your hobbies have gotten old and your screen time has gone way too high and you're starting to get a little stir crazy. So this is David. So one afternoon, he's walking around on the rooftop of his palace where he could look out over the city that he ruled. And all of a sudden, he notices a beautiful woman bathing on her rooftop, which might seem kind of strange to you and I, right? Because who has a bathtub on their roof? But back then, rainwater would gather on the rooftop and it made a lot of sense. But David never should have been on this rooftop to begin with. The most dangerous place for you to be is in a place you never should have been in the first place. And that's where David was. So he wants to know more about her. And it's obviously an abuse of power, but David is the king. And in that culture, the king gets what the king wants. And in this case, David wants her. The most dangerous person for you to be with is any person you should have never been with in the first place. So he sends out his men to find out about her, and this was their report. She is Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, and the wife of Uriah the Hittite. So the messenger didn't just tell David her name. He made sure that David knew Bathsheba was someone's daughter and Bathsheba was someone's wife. In other words, I have an idea of what you want, king, but this isn't a good idea. She isn't an object. She is a human being with a family, and she is not yours to have. But David, he didn't care about that. His judgment was clouded by his desires, his hormones. He wasn't thinking clearly about what was right or what was honoring to other people. And it's pretty easy to see that David made a few assumptions in this moment. Maybe an assumption like, I'm an exception to the rule. Or, what I want, it's just not that bad. Or, I can deal with whatever happens as a result of this. Without any question, both as a human being and as a leader, the king of God's chosen people, for crying out loud, David abuses his power. He has Bathsheba, a married woman, brought to him. He has sex with Bathsheba, and it is highly likely that sexual encounter was forced by David. And from this sexual encounter, Bathsheba becomes pregnant. At every single turn, David seems to think that he is an absolute exception to the rules. But he isn't. Far from it. David isn't above right and wrong. There are very real consequences when we make poor decisions. Now, David could have stopped right there. He could have said, you know what? I'm going to own up to my blatant selfishness. I'm going to own up to my sin. And things wouldn't have gotten worse than they already are. But he didn't do that. His abuse of power continues, and things kept snowballing. So David decides to call Uriah, who was Bathsheba's husband, home from war, and try to get Uriah to sleep with her. And the thinking was that if Uriah came home and slept with his wife, then everyone would say that the baby was Uriah's and not his. Now we're getting into this is like reality show territory, right? This thing is getting complex, right? But when Uriah gets home, he doesn't feel like it's right to sleep in his own bed while his friends and fellow soldiers are out fighting a war. So he slept outside the palace instead. So David invites Uriah over for dinner, hoping to get him drunk so that he would go home and sleep with his wife. Nope, Uriah still won't go back to his house. So now David is desperate to hide what he's done. He gives an order for Uriah to go back to war. But this time, David wants Uriah stationed on the front lines where the fighting was the most dangerous. Because if David couldn't cover up Bathsheba's pregnancy, then Uriah had to be taken out of the picture completely. And that's what happened. Uriah was killed. And afterward, David made Bathsheba one of his wives. And for those of us keeping score at home, it is not a stretch to say that David is a lazy, irresponsible military leader who becomes a peeping Tom, abuser, adulterer, liar, mobster, murderer. Just so we're clear, people, okay? And we listen to this story and we're like, what in the world? Like, what was David thinking? These are terrible decisions. I mean, these are beyond terrible decisions. And you aren't wrong if you think that. I think that. These are terrible decisions. And what happens in this story is a much discussed and much debated thing when it comes to faith circles. And in the constant discourse of who was at fault, was it really rape? Was David really a monster? There is something critically important that's lost. It's something that seems to fade in the background, like you taking a picture with your iPhone in portrait setting. And that really is what we want and need to bring into focus. What we need to focus on is the fact that this sobering reality that the value and respect and humanity of Bathsheba is completely diminished. Somehow, we tend to make David the focus of this story. And Bathsheba and the way her life is sent into upheaval, the loss, the pain, the heartache, like that just becomes an aside. Bathsheba becomes diminished. It has been said that history is written by the victors, but it's the victims who write the memoirs. Bathsheba would have penned the memoir in this story, and it is her story and her pain that echoes to teach us an invaluable lesson. There are probably times with any of us where what we want and what we think that we need completely clouds our need and capacity to value other people. And sure, you and I haven't been nearly as extreme as things are in this story, but we're all capable of getting stuck in a storm because we created the weather. If we had slowed down, if we had been honest with ourselves, if we had a bit of perspective, then maybe things wouldn't have gone downhill so fast. But sometimes, people, when the pressure is on, you and I, we just lose perspective. And we can convince ourselves, hey, I'm the exception. We can believe that, you know what, I won't have regrets. I won't get caught. We can turn it around and make it right. It won't turn out like everyone else. We have a relationship that others can't possibly understand. Look, we're in denial. And if we aren't careful, we can wind up making a load of bad decisions just like David did. Maybe not that extreme, but still very, very bad decisions. And without even realizing it, we do not even think that there is another person paying a very steep price for our selfishness. See, over and over again, David was asking, what can I get away with? How can I avoid these consequences? Every decision he made was through that perspective. And because he was the only person speaking into his decisions, he did things that he knew he shouldn't just to get what he wanted, to such a degree that Bathsheba's value, her well-being, and her feeling seemed to never, ever even be a consideration. When we believe we're the exception to the rule, or we feel like we can't be okay without a relationship, we can end up justifying bad decisions. We can justify bad situations. We can tell ourselves, hey, things are okay when they really, really aren't. And this is a temptation that all of us face, or we will face at some point. The truth is this: the pressure to be with someone can cause you to settle for anything. We end up settling for situations, or settling for people, or for relationships that aren't going to be the best for you or for the other person in the long run, especially when the pressure we are under is self-imposed. And we cannot lose sight of this, people. Settling for anything can mean that all the while fading in the background is another person, somebody with intrinsic value on the other side of our misplaced desire that we may be hurting deeply all along the way. So, when it comes to dating, it helps for you and I to be honest with ourselves. It helps for you and I to ask ourselves the right questions. Questions like, is there any area where you feel pressure to get something or do something that you don't actually need? Is there any area where you find yourself thinking, hey, that may be true for everybody else, but it's just simply not true for me or for us? Here's another question. Is there anything that makes you think that you have things under control, even when everyone else may be telling you differently? In other words, is there an area where you're settling for something or someone that you know you shouldn't? So you may be wondering, is this how David's story ended? No, it's not. David recognized that he was wrong, but he didn't recognize it alone. It took someone else speaking up and David being willing to listen. And sometimes for you and I to see things clearly, it takes someone being real and honest with us, even when that's not easy. But it also takes you and I being willing to listen. So this week, I want to encourage you to do 3 things, okay? Number 1, find someone to speak into your dating life, okay? This could be a wise friend. It could be your small group leader. It could be a trusted adult. Think about the people in your life that you trust, and then identify someone who will be completely real with you, okay? That's number 1. Number 2, ask them to help you see areas where you're not honest with yourself or facing the truth in your life. And I get it. This part isn't easy. This part might even be scary. And it isn't like you have to share every deepest, darkest secret to start out with, but you do have to start somewhere. And chances are they'll be able to see things just because they know you. Now, number 3, listen to them. All right, look, let me say that again. Listen to them. Even if you find someone you trust and they have all the wisest things to say, that wisdom is wasted if you and I won't listen. So make a decision to always give this person a chance to say what they see, to always be honest with you, even when, and look, especially when it's something you may not want to hear. Because if you don't want to hear their thoughts on the situation, there's a good chance you need to, all right? So let me ask you a few difficult questions. Do you have someone to help you gain perspective as it relates to your relationships? Are you being honest enough with yourself to let someone in who will help you reach the most potential in both your dating life and your life in general? Are you perhaps manipulating a relationship for personal gain? Have you convinced yourself that, hey, it's no big deal? And this question is tough. Much like David, are you abusing your own power or your own popularity? Maybe you really need to let someone else in. And being honest with yourself now will save you a lot of pain later. And I'm not talking about like 10 years from now, although that's possible too. I'm saying it can save you a lot of regret and baggage just weeks or just months from now. The reality is that all of us can end up in a million different places that we didn't want to be in by accident, all because we never asked tough questions and we never made difficult decisions. But to end up where you want to be in dating, in relationships, in life, to see potential in the person you date, you need to be honest with yourself and you need to let someone else be honest with you. Remember, the pressure to be with someone can cause you to settle for anything. And God doesn't want you to settle. God wants you to thrive.